The estate was less than 10 minutes away from being finalized when a name nobody in the room recognized changed everything. My name is Patricia Bennett. I am 70 years old, a retired librarian, and until that afternoon, I believed I was about to lose the last connection I had to my mother's true wishes. The conference room where the estate hearing was taking place felt smaller than it should have. Family members filled every chair. Attorneys sat behind neat stacks of documents. A large framed photograph of my mother, Eleanor Bennett, rested on a side table near a vase of white flowers. She had been gone for only 4 months, yet it already felt as though people were rewriting who she had been. My younger brother, Richard, sat across from me wearing the confident expression he had carried ever since the new will appeared. According to that document, nearly everything belonged to him. The family home, most of the savings, several investment accounts. My share was so small that it felt almost symbolic. At first, everyone accepted the explanation. Richard insisted that our mother had changed her mind during her final year. He said she wanted to reward the child who stayed closest to her. He said she had become disappointed in people who lived farther away. The problem was that none of it sounded like my mother. For as long as I could remember, she believed fairness mattered. She repeated those words throughout our lives. Fairness matters. She said it when dividing holiday gifts between grandchildren. She said it when settling arguments. She said it even during difficult moments when family disagreements threatened to create lasting resentment. Yet now I was expected to believe she had quietly abandoned those values and left nearly everything to one child. Attorney James Walker reviewed the final paperwork while relatives whispered among themselves. Several of them avoided looking at me directly. I could almost hear their assumptions. Patricia is upset because she did not get what she wanted. Patricia cannot accept reality. Patricia should move on. The truth was far simpler. If my mother had genuinely made that decision, I would have respected it. What troubled me was how completely the new will contradicted the woman I knew. James cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses. If there are no further objections, we can proceed with the final certification process. My stomach tightened. Months of questions. Months of sleepless nights. Months of searching for answers. And now everything was ending. Richard nodded immediately. His attorney smiled. Several relatives appeared relieved. Then something unexpected happened. One of the legal assistants entered the room carrying a thin folder. She walked directly to James and whispered something in his ear. I watched his expression change. First confusion, then surprise, then curiosity. The room gradually fell silent. James opened the folder and reviewed a single page. He read it twice before looking up. Before we continue, he said carefully, there is a matter that has just come to our attention. Nobody moved. Richard frowned slightly. What kind of matter? James glanced back at the document. A name has appeared in connection with the execution of the revised will. Richard's confidence seemed to waver for the first time. What name? The attorney paused. That is precisely the issue. None of us know who she is. A ripple of confusion spread through the room. I stared at the paper in his hand. Somewhere inside that folder was the name of a woman no one remembered. A woman who apparently witnessed one of the most important moments of my mother's life. And although I could not explain why, something deep inside me whispered that our entire family was about to discover a truth that had been hidden for far too long. Nobody spoke for several seconds after attorney James Walker mentioned the unfamiliar name. The silence felt almost physical. Family members exchanged confused looks. Even Richard appeared genuinely surprised. The legal assistant remained standing beside the table while James continued reviewing the document. I watched carefully, searching for any clue hidden in his expression. Who is she? One of my cousins finally asked. James adjusted his glasses again. According to this notation, her name is Margaret Holloway. The name meant nothing to me. Judging by the reactions around the room, it meant nothing to anyone else either. Richard immediately shook his head. I have never heard that name before. His answer came quickly, perhaps too quickly. I could not tell whether he was being honest or simply distancing himself from something unexpected. James continued reading. The records indicate she was present on the day the revised will was signed. Another wave of confusion moved through the room. If that was true, then Margaret Holloway had been present during one of the most important legal events of my mother's final years. Yet nobody remembered her. Not the family. Not the attorneys. Not even Richard, who claimed to have been closely involved in everything concerning our mother's affairs. The meeting eventually adjourned without finalizing the estate. For the first time in months, the process stopped moving toward an ending. Instead, it turned in a completely different direction. As relatives slowly gathered their belongings, conversations immediately shifted toward the mystery surrounding the unknown witness. Some believed it was probably an administrative error. Others suspected a clerical mistake. I was not so sure. Outside the building, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the parking lot. I stood beside my car watching family members leave one by one. Richard eventually approached me. It was the first time we had spoken privately in weeks. "Do not get your hopes up," he said. His voice sounded controlled, but there was tension beneath it. "This probably means nothing." I looked at him carefully. "Then why are you worried?" For a brief moment, he seemed caught off guard. Then he forced a smile. "I am not worried." Without another word, he walked away. I watched him leave and realized something important. For months, Richard had appeared completely confident. Today was different. The confidence was still there, but cracks had begun to show. That evening, I drove home thinking about my mother. The house felt unusually quiet when I entered. I placed my purse on the kitchen counter and sat beside the window overlooking my backyard. Memories returned almost immediately. During the final years of her life, my mother often talked about family harmony. She disliked conflict. She disliked secrets even more. One particular conversation came back to me with surprising clarity. We were sitting on her porch sharing iced tea during a warm summer afternoon. Out of nowhere, she looked at me and said, "Patricia, fairness matters even when people make it difficult." At the time, I assumed she was talking about a disagreement involving neighbors. Now I wondered whether she had been thinking about something else entirely. The following morning, I received a phone call from James. "I spent most of the evening reviewing old files," he said. "And?" I asked. "Margaret Holloway appears in exactly one place." My pulse quickened immediately. "Where?" There was a brief pause. A witness acknowledgement attached to the revised will. I sat upright. "Only one place. Only one." His voice grew more serious. "Patricia, I have handled estate matters for over 30 years. It is unusual for someone connected to an important document to leave behind almost no trace at all." As the call ended, I stared at the notebook lying on my kitchen table. For months, I had been searching for an explanation. Now I had something better. I had a mystery. And somehow, I felt certain that finding Margaret Holloway would lead directly to the truth about what really happened on the day my mother's will changed. I spent the next several days thinking less about the revised will and more about my mother herself. The more I reflected on her final years, the less sense the document made. It was not simply the unequal distribution of assets that bothered me. It was the way the entire thing seemed disconnected from her character. My mother, Eleanor Bennett, believed that family disagreements should be resolved before they became permanent wounds. She spent decades making certain nobody felt overlooked. Birthdays were carefully planned. Holiday gifts were thoughtfully balanced. Even small family traditions reflected her desire to treat people fairly. One rainy afternoon, I opened an old photo album that had been sitting untouched on a shelf in my living room. As I turned the pages, memories surfaced with surprising clarity. There was a photograph from a 4th of July picnic nearly 15 years earlier. My mother stood between Richard and me, smiling as though nothing could ever come between her children. Another picture showed her at a Thanksgiving gathering, insisting that every grandchild receive exactly the same number of presents before anyone opened a single box. Looking at those photographs, I found myself hearing her voice again. "Fairness matters." The phrase appeared repeatedly throughout my memories. The more often it returned, the more convinced I became that something about the revised will was wrong. A few days later, attorney James Walker invited me to his office. The building occupied the second floor of a quiet brick structure downtown. His office overlooked a small park where parents pushed strollers and retirees walked dogs along winding paths. The peaceful scene outside contrasted sharply with the questions we were discussing inside. James spread several documents across his desk. "I have been reviewing everything connected to the revised will," he said, "and I keep finding details that bother me." My attention immediately sharpened. "What kind of details?" He pointed toward a series of signatures and dates. Nothing dramatic by itself, but together they create an unusual picture. According to the records, the revised will had been executed during a period when my mother's health was declining. Yet there were very few supporting documents explaining why such significant changes had been made. No letters. No written statements. No notes from conversations. For a decision that dramatically altered her estate plan. The paper trail seemed surprisingly thin. Could that happen normally? I asked. James nodded slowly. It can. But most people leave behind some indication of why they made major changes. He leaned back in his chair. Your mother was known for documenting things. That makes the absence stand out even more. As I drove home later that afternoon, another memory returned unexpectedly. About 8 months before her passing, my mother invited me to lunch at a small restaurant near her church. We spent nearly 2 hours talking about family, retirement, and her hopes for the future. At one point, she became unusually serious. Promise me something, she said. Do not let misunderstandings become permanent. At the time, I assumed she was speaking generally. Now those words felt strangely important. That evening, I called James again. Do you think my mother knew something was wrong? I asked. There was a brief silence before he answered. I do not know, but I think there are still pieces of this story we have not found. After the call ended, I stood beside my kitchen window watching rain fall across the backyard. Somewhere inside the missing pieces was an explanation. Not just for the revised will, not just for the mysterious witness, but for why a woman who spent her entire life preaching fairness seemed to leave behind a document that reflected the exact opposite. And for the first time, I began to believe that finding the truth would require looking beyond paperwork and into the final months of my mother's life. The more questions we asked about the revised will, the more unusual the situation became. A week after my meeting with attorney James Walker, he called and asked me to stop by his office again. His tone was different this time, more focused, more concerned. When I arrived, several folders were spread across his conference table. James looked as though he had spent the previous night reviewing every page personally. I found something, he said. I sat down immediately. What is it? He slid a document toward me. At first glance, it appeared ordinary. It contained appointment records connected to the law office that handled the revised will. But one date immediately caught my attention. It matched a period when my mother's health had been particularly fragile. According to these records, James explained, the revised will was signed on a Tuesday afternoon. I nodded, and he leaned forward. The problem is that several other records place your mother somewhere else earlier that same day. My stomach tightened. What does that mean? James shook his head. I am not saying anything improper happened, but the timeline is becoming difficult to understand. As we continued reviewing documents, additional inconsistencies emerged. Small details, nothing dramatic by itself. Yet together they painted a picture that felt increasingly strange. The revised will contained major changes, but there were almost no notes explaining why those changes were necessary. There was a witness nobody seemed to remember, and now there were questions about the circumstances surrounding the signing itself. That evening, I drove to the assisted living community where my mother spent part of her final year. I had not visited since her passing. The familiar building brought back a mixture of comfort and sadness. Several staff members still remembered her. My mother had been well-liked. She attended activities regularly and somehow managed to learn everyone's birthday. One employee named Karen agreed to speak with me. We sat in a quiet lounge overlooking a small garden. Your mother talked about family often, Karen said. She was very proud of both her children. I listened carefully. Did she ever mention changing her will? Karen thought for several moments. Not that I remember. Then she smiled faintly. What I remember most is how often she talked about treating people fairly. The familiar phrase sent a chill through me. Fairness matters. There it was again. Not from family. Not from legal documents. From someone completely outside the dispute. As our conversation continued, Karen recalled something else. Several months before my mother's passing, she seemed upset after a meeting involving paperwork. She never explained the details, but according to Karen, she appeared unusually distracted for several days afterward. Did she say who she met with? I asked. Karen shook her head. No, but I remember thinking it was unlike her. She was usually very open. Driving home that night, my thoughts refused to settle. For months, everyone focused on the revised will itself. Yet increasingly, I found myself focusing on my mother. The woman who preached fairness. The woman who documented everything. The woman who believed misunderstandings should never become permanent. None of those qualities aligned with the document now controlling her estate. The following morning, James left a voicemail asking me to call him immediately. When I returned the call, his voice carried a level of urgency I had not heard before. Patricia, he said, I finally located the original intake records connected to the revised will. My heart immediately accelerated. Did you find something important? There was a pause. Then he answered, I found a reference to Margaret Holloway. And for the first time, we may have a way to find her. For the first time since the revised will appeared, I felt as though we were moving towards something tangible. Up until that moment, every lead seemed to dissolve into uncertainty. Documents raised questions. Memories created doubts. But now there was an actual person connected to the mystery. A witness. Someone who might finally explain what happened during the final months of my mother's life. Later that afternoon, I met James at his office. He handed me a photocopy of an old intake form from the law firm that prepared the revised will. The paper had yellowed slightly with age. Near the bottom, beneath several administrative notes, appeared a handwritten reference to Margaret Holloway. It was not much, just a name and an outdated mailing address. Yet it was more information than we had possessed only days earlier. Do you think she still lives there? I asked. James shook his head. I have no idea. The address is nearly 4 years old. He paused before adding, but it is a place to start. The next morning, I drove nearly 60 miles to a small town outside the city. The neighborhood listed on the form consisted of modest homes lined with mature oak trees. It was quiet and well-maintained. Children rode bicycles along sidewalks while retirees tended flower gardens. When I arrived at the address, I discovered that the house had been sold 2 years earlier. My brief surge of optimism immediately faded. Still, I knocked on the door. An elderly couple answered. They had never heard of Margaret Holloway, but after a few minutes of conversation, the husband remembered something useful. The woman who lived here before us moved into a retirement community, he said. I cannot remember the name of the place. It was not much, but it was enough to keep searching. Over the next several days, I made phone calls, visited offices, and followed every small lead I could find. Some ended quickly, others led nowhere. More than once, I wondered whether I was wasting my time. Richard certainly thought so. He called one evening after hearing about my search through relatives. You are chasing ghosts, he said. His tone carried a mixture of irritation and disbelief. Maybe, I replied. But ghosts do not usually sign legal documents. The silence that followed lasted several seconds. Then he changed the subject entirely. After the call ended, I sat quietly in my living room thinking about his reaction. Months earlier, Richard would have dismissed my concerns with confidence. Now he seemed increasingly uncomfortable whenever Margaret Holloway's name surfaced. That change did not prove anything, but I noticed it. 3 days later, an unexpected breakthrough arrived. A receptionist at a regional retirement center returned one of my messages. She could not share private resident information, but after I explained the legal situation, she agreed to check whether a Margaret Holloway had ever lived there. I waited anxiously while she placed me on hold. When she returned, her answer made my heart race. Yes, she said. A Margaret Holloway was a resident here until last year. I gripped the phone tighter. Do you know where she went? There was another pause. Papers shuffled in the background. Then the receptionist spoke again. According to our records, she transferred to a senior living community in northern Missouri. For several moments, I could not speak. After weeks of uncertainty, Margaret Holloway had suddenly become real. Not just a name on a document. Not just a forgotten witness. A real person living somewhere hundreds of miles away. As I ended the call, I felt a strange mixture of hope and nervousness. Because for the first time, I could see a path toward the truth. And deep down, I suspected that Margaret Holloway already knew the answer everyone else had been searching for. The discovery of Margaret Holloway's location changed everything. For weeks, the mystery had existed only on paper. Now it had an address, a community, and most importantly, a real person connected to the revised will. The problem was time. Attorney James Walker informed me that Richard's legal team was already pushing to restart the estate proceedings. They argued that enough delays had occurred. They wanted the matter resolved quickly. If Margaret possessed information capable of explaining what happened, we needed to find her before the process moved forward again. 2 days later, I found myself driving north through rolling farmland and small Midwestern towns. The senior living community was nearly 400 miles away. During the drive, I replayed every detail of the case in my mind. The revised will, the missing explanations, the unusual timeline, the witness nobody remembered. Individually, Each detail seemed insignificant. Together, they formed a pattern I could not ignore. By late afternoon, I arrived at the community. It was a quiet place surrounded by trees and walking paths. Residents sat on shaded benches while others gathered near a garden courtyard. The peaceful setting felt far removed from legal disputes and family conflict. Inside the main office, a receptionist greeted me kindly. After I explained the situation, she reviewed several records before offering a sympathetic smile. "Margaret still lives here," she said. My heart immediately accelerated. "May I speak with her?" The receptionist hesitated. "That will be her decision." A few minutes later, she returned with disappointing news. Margaret had declined visitors. According to staff, she rarely met with strangers. I thanked the receptionist and walked back toward my car feeling defeated. After traveling hundreds of miles, I was no closer to the truth than before. As I sat behind the steering wheel, I considered turning around and driving home immediately. Then I remembered my mother's voice. Fairness matters. The words had guided me through every setback so far. I decided not to leave. Instead, I checked into a nearby motel and stayed the night. The following morning, I returned to the community carrying something different. Not legal documents. Not questions about the will. I brought an old photograph of my mother. The receptionist recognized me instantly. After a brief conversation, she agreed to show the photograph to Margaret. Nearly 20 minutes passed. Then something unexpected happened. The receptionist returned and quietly said, "She would like to see you." My pulse raced as I followed her down a hallway lined with framed paintings and family photographs. At the end of the corridor, she stopped outside a small sitting room. An elderly woman sat beside a window overlooking the gardens. Her silver hair was neatly arranged, and her posture remained remarkably straight despite her age. When she saw the photograph in my hands, her expression changed immediately. "Eleanor," she said softly. Hearing my mother's name spoken by a stranger sent a chill through me. I introduced myself and explained who I was. Margaret listened carefully without interruption. When I finally mentioned the revised will, she closed her eyes briefly and took a slow breath. The reaction was impossible to miss. She knew exactly what I was talking about. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then she looked directly at me. "I wondered if someone would eventually come looking," she said quietly. Every question that had haunted me for months suddenly felt closer than ever to being answered. And as I sat down across from Margaret Holloway, I realized that the truth about my mother's final wishes had been waiting inside her memory all along. Margaret Holloway studied my face for several moments before speaking again. The sitting room remained quiet except for the faint sound of birds outside the window. Sunlight filtered through the curtains and illuminated the photograph of my mother resting in my hands. "Eleanor was a good woman," Margaret said softly. "That is why I have regretted staying silent for so long." My pulse quickened immediately. I leaned forward slightly, but allowed her to continue at her own pace. She was well into her 80s, and it was clear that the memories she was about to share carried considerable weight. "How did you know my mother?" I asked. Margaret smiled faintly. "We met through a community volunteer program. We became friends during the last few years of her life." That answer alone surprised me. My mother was always making new friends, but I had never heard her mention Margaret. Then again, during her final years, there were many people who drifted in and out of her daily routine. Margaret folded her hands in her lap and stared briefly toward the garden outside. "The day everyone keeps asking about is still very clear in my mind," she said. My heart immediately accelerated. For months, I had searched for someone who could explain what happened during the signing of the revised will. Now I was finally sitting across from that person. "Were you there?" I asked quietly. She nodded. "Yes." The single word seemed to change the atmosphere of the room. Margaret explained that she had been asked to serve as a witness because she happened to be visiting the office building where the meeting took place. A staff member needed an additional witness signature. At the time, it appeared routine. Nothing about the request seemed unusual. "I did not know the details of the document," she said. "I only knew Eleanor wanted to discuss something important." As she continued, several pieces of the puzzle began falling into place. According to Margaret, my mother seemed distracted throughout the meeting. Not confused, not incapable, simply troubled. More than once, she asked questions about the paperwork placed before her. "Do you remember what she asked?" I said. Margaret nodded slowly. She kept returning to the same concern. My chest tightened. "What concern?" Margaret looked directly at me. She wanted reassurance that both of her children would be treated fairly. For several seconds, I could not speak. The familiar phrase had followed me throughout this entire journey. Fairness matters. Hearing it again from the one witness connected to the revised will felt almost unreal. Margaret continued. I remember it clearly because Eleanor repeated it more than once. She paused before adding. She said fairness was the most important thing she wanted to leave behind. A chill moved through me. The revised will accomplish the exact opposite. Margaret then revealed something even more surprising. After the meeting ended, my mother remained behind for a private conversation with one of the individuals handling the paperwork. Margaret could not hear every word, but she remembered my mother expressing concern about changes she had only recently discovered. What kind of changes? I asked. Margaret shook her head. I do not know, but I remember her saying that something did not match what she believed had been discussed earlier. The room suddenly felt smaller. Every answer seemed to create an even larger question. Margaret reached toward a small side table and retrieved an envelope that appeared years old. I kept this because I always felt uneasy, she said quietly. My eyes fixed on the envelope immediately. Then she handed it to me, and what I saw written across the front made me realize the truth might be far bigger than anyone had imagined. My hands trembled slightly as I turned the envelope over. The paper looked old but carefully preserved. Across the front, written in my mother's unmistakable handwriting, were 4 simple words. Open if questions arise. For several seconds, neither Margaret nor I spoke. I stared at the envelope, struggling to understand why something so important had remained hidden for so long. Margaret finally broke the silence. Eleanor gave that to me the day of the meeting, she said quietly. She told me to keep it only if I ever felt something was wrong. My pulse raced. Why did you not come forward sooner? Margaret lowered her eyes. Because after your mother passed away, nobody contacted me. Then my health declined. I moved twice. And eventually I convinced myself that perhaps my concerns were unnecessary. She paused, but I never threw the envelope away. With her permission, I carefully opened it. Inside was a folded letter written entirely by my mother. The moment I saw the handwriting, emotion caught in my throat. It felt as though she was suddenly sitting beside us again. I began reading. The letter was not a legal document. It was something far more personal. My mother explained that she had recently reviewed paperwork concerning her estate and was worried that misunderstandings could develop if certain discussions were not properly documented. She wrote about her desire for fairness. She wrote about family unity. Most importantly, she wrote that she never intended for one child to receive substantially more than the other. I read that sentence twice, then a third time. Margaret watched quietly as tears filled my eyes. There is more, she said. Near the end of the letter, my mother described feeling uncomfortable after discovering revisions that did not reflect the balance she believed had been discussed. She intended to schedule another meeting to clarify matters. According to the date on the letter, that meeting was supposed to happen only a few weeks later. It never did. Her health declined unexpectedly, and the opportunity disappeared. I immediately called James Walker. After listening carefully, he asked to speak directly with Margaret. The conversation lasted nearly an hour. By the time it ended, James sounded stunned. Patricia, he said, you need to come back immediately. The following day, Margaret agreed to provide a formal statement. Together, we traveled back and met with James at his office. The letter was examined, documented, and compared with other samples of my mother's handwriting. Everything matched. Margaret then described the meeting she witnessed in remarkable detail. She repeated how often my mother spoke about treating both children fairly. She repeated her concerns about changes she had recently noticed. Most importantly, she confirmed that my mother never expressed any desire to leave nearly everything to Richard. As the statement concluded, the room fell silent. Months of uncertainty were finally giving way to facts. James leaned back in his chair and removed his glasses. This changes the entire case, he said. The estate hearing was reopened almost immediately. News spread quickly through the family. Some relatives called to apologize for doubting me. Others simply wanted to know what had happened. Richard remained unusually quiet. Then, 2 days before the new hearing, something unexpected occurred. His attorney contacted James and requested an emergency meeting. Nobody knew why. Nobody knew what would be discussed. But as I prepared for the hearing that would finally determine my mother's true wishes, I realized the mystery was nearly over. After months of searching, the final witness had spoken, and now the truth was about to enter the room where it should have been heard from the very beginning. The reopened hearing took place less than 2 weeks later. This time, the atmosphere felt entirely different. When I entered the conference room, I immediately noticed that many of the people who once avoided eye contact now greeted me warmly. Relatives who had accepted the revised will without question now understood there was far more to the story. Attorney James Walker sat beside me reviewing final documents. Across the room, Richard appeared noticeably different from the confident man I had watched during the earlier proceedings. He looked tired, older somehow. The emergency meeting requested by his attorney had produced no dramatic announcement, but it was clear something had changed. As the hearing began, Margaret Holloway provided her formal testimony. Despite her age, her voice remained steady and clear. She described meeting my mother. She described witnessing the signing process. She described my mother's repeated concern that both children be treated fairly. Then the letter was introduced into the record. The room became completely silent as portions were read aloud. Hearing my mother's words again felt both comforting and heartbreaking. She spoke about fairness. She spoke about family harmony. She spoke about wanting to prevent misunderstandings. Most importantly, she clearly stated that she never intended for one child to receive substantially more than the other. The effect on the room was immediate. What had once been a complicated dispute suddenly became remarkably simple. The revised will no longer stood alone. It now existed beside testimony, documentation, and my mother's own written explanation of her concerns. When Richard's attorney rose to respond, his argument was noticeably restrained. There were no accusations, no attempts to attack Margaret's credibility. Instead, he acknowledged that the newly discovered evidence raised serious questions about whether the revised will reflected my mother's final intentions. Then something happened that I never expected. Richard stood up and asked permission to speak. The room fell quiet. He looked down briefly before addressing everyone. I believed I was honoring what Mom wanted, he said. His voice was softer than I had ever heard it. But after seeing the letter and hearing Margaret's testimony, I cannot say that anymore. Several relatives exchanged surprised glances. Richard continued, if the document does not reflect her wishes, then it should not determine her legacy. For a moment, nobody spoke. Months of tension seemed to loosen all at once. The hearing continued, but the outcome was becoming clear. After reviewing all available evidence, James presented a recommendation supported by the estate representatives. The revised will would no longer be treated as the controlling expression of my mother's intent. Instead, the estate would be administered according to the prior estate plan that reflected the balanced distribution she had maintained for years. By the end of the afternoon, the matter was resolved. There was no celebration, no dramatic victory, only a deep sense of relief. As people gathered their belongings and prepared to leave, several relatives approached Margaret to thank her. Others quietly apologized for assumptions they had made. I spoke with Richard outside beneath a bright autumn sky. For a long moment, neither of us said anything. Then he looked toward the parking lot and sighed. Mom always said fairness mattered, he said. I smiled faintly. Yes, she did. He nodded. I should have remembered that sooner. We stood there together for a few minutes, not as opponents, but as two aging children reflecting on the woman who raised us. Later that evening, I returned home and placed my mother's letter inside a protective frame. It now rests on a bookshelf in my living room. Not because it changed an estate, not because it resolved a legal dispute, but because it preserved something far more important. The truth about who my mother really was. In the end, the most valuable inheritance she left behind was not a house, a bank account, or an investment portfolio. It was a simple principle she repeated throughout her life. Fairness matters. And thanks to one forgotten witness who finally came forward, that truth will never be forgotten again.